Well, welcome everyone for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn, the Connecticut Yankee occupation of St. Augustine, Florida, 1862 to 1865. Our speaker today, Dr. Eric Paul Totten, completed his PhD in 2020 at the University of Arkansas, where he is currently an instructor in the Department of History. He's the author of Civil Military Communities in Conflict, the 1862 Occupation of St. Augustine, Florida, and the Politics of Emancipation, which will appear in the book Hundreds of Little Wars, Community Conflict, and the Real Civil War, edited by G. David Scheffler and Matthew Smith. The book will be published by LSU Press in 2025, so it's coming. And Eric was at the museum recently as a grantee of the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium. So we're really excited to have him here today to talk about his project and learn a little bit about what he found in our collection. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Jen, for that lovely introduction. I truly appreciate it. First, I would like to thank the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History for inviting me to this lunch and learn. Second, I would like to thank Sarah Dixon and her collection associates, Chiana Calafor, Julia Morrow, and Elaine Peters. They are true professionals and were extremely helpful while I was at the museum. I don't know how many of the attendees have actually been to the museum or the research library, but if you have not, you really should make the journey. It is a lovely building with fascinating exhibits and a truly impressive primary and secondary source collection. So what I'm going to do, and I would also like to thank the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium for the grant that allowed me to do my research not only at the Connecticut Museum, but also at the New Hampshire Historical Society and the Massachusetts Historical Society. And all of that research is going to be used to further understand military occupation during the Civil War, not only in Northeast Arkansas, pardon me, Northeast Florida. I live in Arkansas. Not only in Northeast Florida, but also in South Carolina and beyond. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so I can put on my little PowerPoint presentation that I have made. Okay, can everyone see it? Hopefully. Okay, good. So how do I launch this thing? There it is. Okay. So as Jennifer said, I am Dr. Totten at the University of Arkansas. And the agenda for today, I take sort of a holistic approach to history. I believe that you can't look at an event in isolation and truly understand it because there are so many contingent factors. As I tell my students, history is like building a house of cards. Each block or each card needs to build upon each other in order to get the full picture. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start with some basic facts about Connecticut's answering the call to service. We are going to look at, oops, sorry. Let me go back. We're going to look at the Port Royal expedition, which is where several regiments of Connecticut Infantry, the 6th and the 7th Volunteers, went and participated in this invasion and finally occupation of the Sea Islands of South Carolina. We're going to talk about some of their reactions towards African Americans in the region, which is largely known as the Sea Island Experiment, essentially Northerners attempting to bring free soil ideology and freedom to these African American refugees. And some soldiers liked it, other soldiers did not, as we will see. I want to then highlight just some of the battles that these regiments went through, because in order to understand their occupation of Northeast Florida, you need to understand kind of the trials and tribulations they went through. And that really helps contextualize just why they were so happy in some cases to be in St. Augustine. We're then going to talk about the 7th Connecticut's experience in Northeast Florida. Then we're going to kind of follow them, the 7th and the 6th Connecticut, to the Siege of Battery Wagner, where this is a very famous battle depicted in the movie Glory. If any of you have seen it, Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman in 1989. And it really left an indelible mark on these men. Also, there were key generals in charge of this campaign, like Alfred Terry, who was a colonel at the beginning of the war and then later became a major general of volunteers. From there, we're going to follow the 10th and the 17th Connecticut's occupation of Northeast Florida. Again, trying to figure out, why they enjoy, well, why some of them enjoyed Florida so much, and that yet this experience there is gonna leave. They're gonna have some interesting experiences there as well. And then just sort of briefly talk about how these regiments, after they leave Northeast Florida, they're going to go and really suffer at a series of climactic battles at Drury's Bluff, Petersburg, and finally Fort Fisher. And then kind of end with a lot of the men who were captured in various battles, captured during occupation of various areas, how they ended up in Andersonville prison, and sort of their experiences there as well. And I'm going to do my best to sort of highlight the various collections for each point that kind of illustrates this. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. Now, roughly speaking, Connecticut was very much in favor of free soil ideology at the beginning in the 1850s. The Republican Party rose, for those of you who are aware, in about 1856, and in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And we see a lot of Connecticut Yankees who may not exactly like African Americans, but they certainly do not like slavery. And so we are going to see rising support for the Republican Party inside of Connecticut. And this is kind of exemplified by the election of Governor Buckingham, who is going to be sort of nominated, or I should say elected in 1861 with about 2009 vote majority. And shortly thereafter, we're going to see Abraham Lincoln. He's going to be elected with about a 10,000 plus vote majority. And so we see Connecticut Yankee support for the Republican Party for these ideas of free soil, and certainly opposition to slavery's extension in the territories. When Lincoln is elected, I'm sure we are all aware, South Carolina is going to respond with their ordinance of secession. And essentially, they are going to leave the Union, and this is going to provoke a pretty bitter response from many Connecticut citizens. And what is going to aggravate them even more is at the attempts to reconcile with South Carolina in other seceding states. They have many attempts at compromise, which are either rejected or ignored by various seceding states. And what is really going to end up boiling the blood of a lot of Connecticut citizens is the seizure of northern forts, or I should say forts paid for by the federal government, places obviously like Fort Marion and St. Augustine and elsewhere. They are upset at the seizure of state arsenals, or I should say federal arsenals. They are upset at the seizure of federal post offices, and also the seizure of northern property. Several tens of millions of dollars, in fact, of northern citizens' property and federal property is sequestered, as it's called, by southern states, seceded states. And this is really going to upset a number of individuals all over the North, clearly, because one of the things I like to joke with my students is, for a country, so-called, the Confederacy, built on the protection of property, i.e., human individuals, slaves, they have no problem seizing other people's property. So it's like they want to protect their own property, but they have no problem taking others. I always find that ironic. Essentially, things come to a head with the firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. So we have South Carolina forces and Confederate forces opening up on this federal fort, which is in Charleston Harbor, commanded by Major Anderson. And after about a day of siege, the fort will surrender, having done its honorable duty. And this is going to provoke a rage militaire, as we historians like to call. It's a fancy word, which just means people are really angry and are eager for war. And this rage militaire is going to grip the North, and we're going to see lots of posters like this, which can be found at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. There's going to be calls for the formation of regiments. Now, at first, these regiments are only supposed to be around for a couple of months. And this is part of Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Now, in the process of this call of trying to put down the rebellion, more states in the upper South, so Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, states like that, they are going to be provoked, they call it, into seceding in response to this call for volunteers. Now, the initial process of recruitment is actually a very haphazard one. States are responsible for raising the men themselves, paying bounties to them for their time in service, equipping them with their uniforms, their kit, their weapons, ammunition, all of that, provisions as well, and then rushing them to the defense of Washington, D.C., which many people are worried may be taken over by Confederate forces. Washington, D.C., as you're all aware, is kind of surrounded by hostile actors. You have Maryland, which is not embraced secession, but there are many Marylanders who are in favor of it. Obviously, Virginia has seceded, and so Washington's kind of besieged on three sides. And so the goal is getting men as quickly as possible to the defense of Washington so that the capital will be protected. And this is where we see some initial regiments come to the defense of Washington. As I said, this is a picture from the Library of Congress of the 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery at Fort Richardson. And these men are green. They are very green. Most of them have not had a lot of training. They are they have some grandiose ideas about what combat is going to be like, what army life is going to be like. And most of these men early on are fighting for a war of union. They are not interested in a war of emancipation. And you see that in a lot of the letters early on from Yankees all over the North, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, particularly New Hampshire, by the way. They seem to be some of the most opposed towards emancipation. But anyway, these men are still here coming to the South in order to protect Washington. And this is where they get some of their first experiences with African Americans. And in a lot of their letters, which I'll talk about a bit later, they have mixed feelings about their experiences with African Americans. They mock them, they denigrate them, they call them all sorts of pejorative terms, which I cannot use in polite public. It's a jarring experience for many, but we're going to see over time that more and more Yankees, especially from Connecticut, are going to begin to embrace emancipation as a war aim. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. So, um, without going into too much detail, there's a big battle in Northern Virginia called Bull Run. Alfred Howell Terry, who is a colonel and later becomes a general, he fights there. Joseph R. Hawley of the later 7th Connecticut fights there, as well as a number of other important and famous individuals. And so after this experience at Bull Run, it's pretty much a disaster, the battle. It had started off well. At the beginning of the day, and then it just turned when Confederate reinforcements rushed onto the field and essentially won the day for the Confederates. In the aftermath of this battle, we see Connecticut is forced to raise a number of extra regiments, and these regiments are going to be different than the prior ones. The previous regiments were only required to be in service for 90 days, essentially. And there's some variation there. There were some 1-year regiments, there were some 2-year regiments, but essentially most of the men are there for 90 days, about 3 months. And what the governors and the War Department decides is that this is not an effective way of waging a war, obviously. You want men who are going to be involved in the service for longer. And so we see the creation of these 3-year regiments. And the two of them that I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about is the 6th Connecticut Volunteers, which is led by John Lyman Chapman, famous Connecticut Yankee, very prominent professional in his community before the war. Giving away the story a little bit, he's going to end up falling during the siege of Battery Wagner, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. We also are going to see the raising of the 7th Connecticut Volunteer Infantry under Colonel Joseph Hawley. Hawley is going to really distinguish himself in this war. He is going to make general by the end of the war. He's going to be Alfred Terry's right-hand man, and he's going to be a very prominent official in Connecticut politics after the war as well. Um, so now that you've raised these 3-year regiments, what do you do with them? Where are they going to go? What is their mission? And what General Scott, who is the commander in chief of all U.S. forces, General Winfield Scott, famous veteran of the Mexican-American War, veteran of the Cherokee removal, veteran of the Second Seminole War, America's most famous soldier at the time. He's a Southerner by birth, and he wants to end this war with as little effusion of blood as possible. And so what he does is he comes up with this Anaconda plan. Well, it's really a blockade, but the press mockingly derides it as the Anaconda Plan. And essentially, his goal is to starve the South. He wants to prevent military supplies from getting in. He wants to prevent blockade runners from getting out and back in, essentially hoping that if the Confederacy can't get the weapons and the food that they need and that they aren't able to trade their cotton, then, they will have no choice but to capitulate. That's the general idea. And so what this means is you need to control as many southern ports as possible. You need to cut off as many southern points of access as possible, the major rivers, and obviously, as I said, the major ports. And what the Lincoln administration does early on is decide that they really want to go after Charleston Harbor and the city of Charleston, South Carolina, because it's sort of the original seat of secession. They call it secessia or rebeldom in a number of different cases. I love all these different terms that Northerners come up with talking about Southern seceded states. So they want to seize Charleston. And in order to do that, you need to find a large natural harbor somewhere nearby that is going to be suitable for having a fleet, as well as a sizable contingent of forces that are going to be able to be easily moved to the next point of operations, which is going to be, hopefully, they think, taking the city. They didn't initially envision it being too much of a problem. And what we see is the general who is going to be in charge of this early attempt to find a foothold on the Sea Islands of South Carolina that will be used as a jumping off point for this siege of Charleston is going to be Brigadier General Thomas W. Sherman. Not to be confused with William Tecumseh Sherman, who is very famous in the Civil War, and they have no relation whatsoever, just so we're clear. General Thomas is a very conservative West Point officer. He does not entertain any idea of seizing Southern property. He is not interested in freeing African Americans. He wants a quick war and with little effusion of blood as possible, little seizure of property as possible. Essentially, he wants to go back to the status quo antebellum. And he is going to be in charge of what historians will later call the Port Royal Expedition. So the Port Royal Expedition is a large fleet of about 15,000 men on several dozen transports. And they're making their way to Port Royal, South Carolina, which is a beautiful natural harbor near St. Helena Island and the other Sea Islands of South Carolina. On their way, there's actually a horrible gale that blows the fleet all over creation. I'm going to go forward just one slide. And when this fleet is spread out, I mean, it takes days to get back together. The men are very, very seasick. Two ships actually end up capsizing, and the ammunition is actually lost in the process. And so now you have this need to take this port and a fort guarding it, but you're lacking the ammunition to do so. And I just want to highlight that probably the best account that you can find at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History is the Churchill Woodford Family Papers. This is a little image here. It is 16 pages of the most tiniest writing I have ever seen in my entire life. I mean, I can't blow it up here, but I had to get I wear glasses, and then I also had to get one of those little, what do you call it? Magnifying glasses, and you're sitting there trying to read this very tiny script. But the reason I bring it up is because it is the the greatest and longest, most detailed account I have seen of the passage to Port Royal, the gale that scattered the fleet, and then eventually the bombardment of the town or the port and the seizure of it as well. Um, so this is an image from the U.S. Naval Historical Center. It is the bombardment of Port Royal. The Navy has brought large warships to the region in order to bombard a fort that is guarding Port Royal, which is called Fort Walker. And there, after the bombardment, the two leading regiments that are going to take part in the seizure of this fort are actually going to be the 6th and the 7th Connecticut. And Governor Buckingham is going to be very, very pleased by the fact that it's Connecticut Yankees that are the first to set foot on the soil of rebeldom, as they call it. And these men are then going to go into the interior of the island. They are going to find that most of the white individuals have fled, that the African Americans are jubilant at the arrival of the Yankees, or at least some of them are. A number of African Americans were actually quite worried because they had been told by their Southern masters that the Yankees were going to eat them, which is not true, obviously, but propaganda, fake news. What are you going to do? So they seize this island and they are encountering African Americans. They're also encountering new fruits and flowers, flora and fauna that they've never seen before, and they're quite at first impressed by what they find, and later on they are rather how do I want to put this? They're rather derisive of Southern society. They see the great plantation houses, but they also see the slave shacks, and they see the conditions of African Americans. And many Northern philanthropic organizations, or as we call Northern benevolent societies, essentially charities, they're going to come to the Sea Islands. They're going to come to Port Royal, St. Helena, and other islands. And they are going to begin to try to do what is called the Sea Island Experiment. And the Sea Island Experiment is where these northern charities and religious organizations are trying to help African Americans have a free life, so become self-sufficient farmers, essentially. And it is mixed here and there, depending on the goals. Some individuals, some reformers are very successful because they meet African Americans on their own terms. They're willing to work with these communities. They're very respectful. But others, like Treasury agents from the Treasury Department, their goal is to keep producing cotton, to keep the money flowing, to help the war effort. And this leads to a little bit of conflict between occupying forces and African Americans. And General Sherman, Thomas W. Sherman, obviously, is very derisive of all these efforts. He does not believe that these individuals deserve freedom. He thinks that it's counterproductive. He writes these very, very long telegrams back to Washington where he's not shy in sharing his opinions. And this is going to put him on the outs, really, with Washington's administration. Lincoln is not exactly in favor of emancipation early on in the war. In his heart, he wants it, but politically, he's not able to. He can't embrace emancipation in 1861 or 1862 because, frankly, it will mean the border states will secede from the Union. And as the sort of perhaps fake story goes, Lincoln once said, I may need God on my side, but I definitely need Kentucky, essentially, is what he said. I can't do this with the border states. So he can't go in on emancipation. But many people in his cabinet are in favor of emancipation. So what Sherman is doing is he's not exactly endearing himself to a number of people in Washington. Well, events kind of slowed down after the seizure of Port Royal. The environment of South Carolina is very detrimental to military operations. It is a very swampy area, lots of insects. It is very hot and humid. Obviously, there's snakes and other animals that can be quite disturbing or harmful. And many men begin suffering from sickness. And it is clear that offensive operations are not really going anywhere under Sherman. And eventually, Sherman is removed. I explore this a lot in my dissertation. A lot of it has to do with his conservative politics, the fact he's not willing to embrace emancipation, the fact that he's not really moving his army, because he doesn't believe that his mere 15,000 men are capable of really doing all that much. But what we do see happen is a number of, because of events out west, there are some major battles that happen in Tennessee at Fort Donelson and elsewhere, as well as a major battle, the Battle of Shiloh and the Battle of Pea Ridge in Arkansas. And because of all of these defeats out west, the Confederacy is losing men, and they need more men. And they need to make sure that they are being more circumspect in their defensive arrangements. And so they're going to begin pulling troops back from the coastline of Florida and South Carolina. And that's going to be the opportunity that, sorry, I went forward too quickly, that Sherman is going to use in order to, sorry, on. It doesn't matter. That Sherman is going to use to actually take a number of southern ports. So um, when Robert E. Lee and Judah P. Benjamin removed troops from the coastline of Florida, this is going to enable the Navy and the Army to land troops at places like Fernandina, Florida, Jacksonville, Florida, and St. Augustine, Florida. And well, I'll talk more about the actual, occupation later, but essentially these are little footholds along the coast that are going to be used to, one, support the blockade, but also extend operations further south. And it's going to allow for more coaling centers and again, supply and logistical issues. Well, even after the seizure of these points, Sherman is going to be kicked out of command, and he's going to be replaced by this individual called Major General David Hunter. David Hunter is a through and through abolitionist. He is a true believer in the claw and in the cause of emancipation. And he is going to really make it his life's mission to change this war into a war for emancipation. And so when he takes command of the Department of the South, which is a geographical and bureaucratic entity, essentially it extends from the border of South Carolina, northern South Carolina, all the way down to Key West, Florida. And he is going to issue an order. I think it's called General Order Number 7, where he is going to free all African Americans and grant them their freedom, as I said. And he also, in this letter or this order, alludes to the fact that he's going to begin equipping Seminole natives and other indigenous groups to wage war against Confederate citizens. Well, this is absolutely not what Lincoln needs at this point in time in the war. He does not need the various border states to get really angry at this emancipation action. In fact, Lincoln had already overturned one emancipation action in Missouri by a general called John C. Fremont. And so Lincoln rescinds it in General Order Number 11, which is pictured here. So we see early on in this war that there's a lot of disagreement about what the purpose of the war is, what people are fighting for, and it's causing a bit of a issues in terms of civil military relations. Well, there's a regiment that serves in St. Augustine called the 4th New Hampshire that I primarily study, and they have a bad time there. And essentially, they get into some trouble. They are removed by General Hunter, and even the colonel of the regiment is court-martialed because he had returned a slave to her master. It's a very complicated situation. You can read about it in my book. But essentially, David Hunter, he's kind of bit off more than he can chew. The story that he tells is false. The colonel, a guy called Lewis Bell of New Hampshire, he gets off scot-free, and Hunter is removed. And when Hunter is removed, there is going to be a new sort of invigoration into the new campaign season. And we're going to see the 6th and the 7th Connecticut serve at a battle that is little known today, but at the time was quite important. It's called the Second Battle of Pocataligo along the coast of South Carolina. The idea is that these regiments of mostly New Englanders are going to land at Defusky Island or nearby. They're going to march their way north to try to cut off the Savannah and Charleston Railroad, which is a key supply route between the along this area of the Confederacy. Obviously, Savannah and Charleston are two of their largest cities. Well, the expedition goes very poorly. The 7th Connecticut and the 6th Connecticut distinguished themselves very well in battle. The rebels get news of this landing. It's sort of like a sneaky landing that just goes completely wrong. The Confederates get news of it early on. They rush reinforcements to the area, and there is a 5 mile or so running battle between the various regiments in this expedition and the Confederates. And essentially, by the end of the day, the Union forces have run out of ammunition. There are more reinforcements coming along this railroad, again, Savannah and Charleston, and the Federals are forced to quit the field. And in the process, the 6th Connecticut and the 7th Connecticut, they don't suffer too badly, but they do get some casualties. And but as I said, they distinguish themselves quite well in battle. And here you can see this is sort of an account of the battle that you can find at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. It's part of the 7th Connecticut's um, regimental book. Just to define this, the New South is a newspaper that's actually published by Northern soldiers in and around St. Helena, South Carolina, and the newspaper is quite pro-administration, pro-Republican, pro-emancipation. But again, just an example of like, if you want to learn more about this battle, this is a really good resource to go to, as well as the fact that the museum has complete access to a number of newspapers produced out from Connecticut. And so you can find the Hartford Courant and others, which also detail this battle. You can also see it detailed in the New York Times, which the museum also has access to. So after this battle, we're going to see the 7th Connecticut is going to kind of be shuffled around a little bit. They're going to first go to Fernandina and then Jacksonville. They serve alongside the 1st South Carolina Regiment, which is a African American regiment that they serve with around Jacksonville, and they get into a few skirmishes with some rebels outside of Jacksonville. And then they're going to be sent to St. Augustine, Florida. And so what I have here is this is a piece of my thesis. I kind of just list the various regiments that occupy St. Augustine at different times. And so clearly we're now talking about, the 7th, which comes to St. Augustine in June of 1863. I'm going to tell you a little bit about their experiences. Then we're going to jump to like the 10th Connecticut that comes in late September of 1863. And then I'll jump later on to the 17th Connecticut that came in February of 1864. This is a little bit a map I kind of made for my thesis, and I should really repurpose for a future publication. This is zones of occupation around St. Augustine. And so before I can tell you about the 7th Connecticut inside of St. Augustine, I need you to understand that just because you take a city doesn't mean you control a region. And there's a very famous book called When the Yankees Came by a guy called Stephen V. Ash. He's a very famous historian. It's a great book. It's, most historians have like, what are their top 2, top 3 books? That book is my number 1, I would say. It really changed the direction of my career, my education. And what he does, what Dr. Ash does in that book, is he postulates that the occupied South, as he calls it, has zones of occupation. You have what are called garrisoned towns. Then you have sort of like this extent around the town of Yankee control. Beyond that, you have a region called no man's land. So, here's the garrison town of St. Augustine, where my cursor is. This would be the region of control by, let's just call it 1863. Beyond it is this area of no man's land, which is not really controlled by anyone. You have both Confederate troopers and Confederate guerrillas and Union forces contesting the area, but no one really has control of it. And then you have the Confederate frontier, which is an area that can be exposed to Union forays, to Union raids, but it's pretty much within the control of the Confederacy, as I said. So when you want to look at the experiences of the 7th Connecticut inside of St. Augustine, Florida, there's a number of great resources. And the one that I like to point out is George B. Paddock's Civil War Diary from 1863. You see here pictured his diary. Again, same thing I was telling you about before. You notice that the writing is super small. It's in pencil. This is actually a good page. There are other pages where it's like really, really light and my camera could not really pick it up. And so I had to find like different ways of using my phone to kind of like scan it in and like, how am I going to be able to see this and like wash it through different colors to get it. But if you're interested in sort of like, the occupation of St. Augustine, this diary, as well as Louis Philly's diary and a number of other papers, are absolutely wonderful. And what you find is after all of the hardships that the Seventh has gone through, they fought at James Island, they fought at Secessionville, they fought at Pocotaligo, they are ready for rest. And St. Augustine is the perfect place to do it. So if you recall, I told you that being on the Sea Islands is not very comfortable. It's bad weather, bad food, bad fare, and terrible accommodations. St. Augustine's completely different. St. Augustine, you can set up a nice tent in the fort or stay in one of the rooms of the fort. There are many homes that have been abandoned inside St. Augustine that you can go and live in. There is a tavern, or I should say a hotel with a tavern attached, that you can go and stay in. And so this is described as the best time that the 7th Connecticut ever had during the war. They were very comfortable. They were eating lemons and oranges, oysters, and all sorts of fish. They were supplementing their diet. And at the same time, they were engaged in a series of population expulsions. So, what was going down in St. Augustine is it was a very pro Confederate town at the beginning of the war. When the 4th New Hampshire occupied it, they got along fine with the Southern whites. They did not get along with the Southern African Americans. Well, when the 7th Connecticut arrives, that all ends because Hawley is a through and through abolitionist, and he is not going to tolerate Southern or Confederate sympathizers who refuse to take the oath of allegiance. And so he's going to actually expel somewhere between 300 to 500 individuals at various points of their time there. And this is not exactly does not exactly go down well with a number of the people who are living in the city. And so one of the things I just want to point out is I find it interesting for my work as a scholar of occupation how one regiment from one city, or I should really say state, deals differently with how to treat white Southerners and black Southerners differently than another regiment from another state, even though they're in the same, region of New England. So it illustrates the differences, I would say, between Connecticut Yankees and Granite State soldiers. This is a picture of Fort Marion. One of the things that you see in the Paddock Diary, the Philly Diary, in Joseph Hawley's papers, Alfred Hal Terry's papers, and everyone else who served there, is they were fascinated by this fort. It originated as a Spanish fort back in the Spanish period. So I forgot to mention that St. Augustine is obviously founded by the Spanish in the 1500s. It's one of the longest occupied cities by European descendants in America, besides Pueblo, I think, New Mexico. And it is these men write home very vividly about how fascinating the fort is. They're really interested in like these skeletons that are in a dungeon that may be back to the Spanish period. And they're also quite interested with a group of Spanish Menorcans or descendants of Spanish Menorcans. Minorca is a tiny island in the Mediterranean Sea. The British brought a lot of the Menorcan population to this region, to St. Augustine, or I should say, Menorcans came during the Spanish period and continued to come during the British period. And it was very difficult for Yankees to understand the racial geography of St. Augustine because many Menorcans could look African American or African American descendant. They could also look white. And so a lot of the commanders had a difficulty of figuring out, like, what do I do with these guys? Like, are they, do I treat them like slaves? Do I treat them like free people? It was very confusing for them. Well, in the end, the oysters and fish on the St. John's River has to end eventually, and the regiment, the 6th New Connecticut, the 7th Connecticut, and then other Connecticut regiments, as well as other New England and Yankee regiments in general, they're going to begin siege operations of Battery Wagner. Battery Wagner is a very large fort near South Carolina. It commands Charleston Harbor. If you want to take the city, you are going to have to deal with this fort. And what we're going to see is over the next several months, there is going to be an absolutely grueling slog up the island to get to Battery Wagner and then to actually besiege it. Um, so Battery Wagner is placed right about here, I would say, and so obviously it commands this area. And once that is taken, you'll have an easier time seizing Fort Sumter and then the forts beyond that. And the 6th and the 7th and 10th Connecticut, or pardon me, the 6th and 7th Connecticut, as well as a number of other regiments, really distinguished themselves in this combat. The commander of the 6th, Colonel Chapman, is going to be killed on the ramparts or near the ramparts of Battery Wagner in a heroic act of self-sacrifice for his soldiers. And ultimately, after something like 6 months of very grueling siege warfare, and the Paddock Diary, the Philly Diary, and a number of other documents that you can find at the museum just talk about how horrific it is. Every single day, day and night, it is nothing but a storm of shot and shell on these soldiers who are engaged in siege work. And ultimately, the siege is successful. The Confederate troops leave Battery Wagner, and the 7th and 6th Connecticut are victorious there. Um, Moving on, we're going to see now a new regiment who has been serving elsewhere at various times, the 10th Connecticut. They've engaged in a number of different combat operations in Virginia, at New Bern, North Carolina. They were part of, I believe, the Siege of Battery Wagner at various points in time. It's kind of difficult to track them because sometimes a company is here and a company is there, and it gets difficult trying to juggle who's where. But they are going to come to the streets of St. Augustine in 1864, and they experience initially the same things that the 7th does. They are very happy to be away from the battlefields of, South Carolina and Virginia, North Carolina. They are eating oranges and lemons and oysters and fish. They have an okay relationship with the local population. They are helping African American refugees, and a really good account of their experiences, of the experiences of the 10th, is going to be the John S. Bartlett papers that you can also find at the museum. It is several letters, a wonderful account of, again, just dealing with occupation duty, camp life, and that stuff. But what I find really fascinating is this letter here, dated January 2nd, 1864. And John S. Bartlett relates to us that 21 soldiers of the 10th Connecticut were actually seized during a raid by a very famous cavalry commander in Florida called J.J. Dickinson, who was actually a Mason, which was going to come up later. These men are going to be sent to Andersonville prison. Some of them will return, some of them will survive, some of them will not. But again, if you want to know more about the experience of the 10th, the Bartlett papers are perfect, as well as the Albert Sharp papers, which you can also find at the museum. And Albert Sharp goes into a lot of detail. I'm just showing some pictures of other members of the 10th. One of the things, so the 10th is doing kind of okay, but they're also coming under attack, right? We see again that concept of zones of occupation, the idea that things are kind of tenuous. Sometimes it's safe, sometimes it's not. You can't really go out alone. You do need guards. There's a lot of guerrilla activity, a lot of Confederate cavalry activity, and so after this seizure of several men of the 10th, they're going to have to tighten up a little bit. They're going to have to be a little bit, more disciplined when they go out of town on foraging parties, on wood cutting parties, and the like. This is an image of Charles M. Holmes of the 10th Connecticut, which again you can find at the museum. Now, they have an amazing collection of photographs that really help presentations like this. I also want to highlight this individual here, Henry Clay Trumbull. He is a very famous preacher from the North. And he is actually going to come. He is, I believe, at one point in time, the chaplain to the 10th. And he's going to deliver a series of very invigorating religious sermons. And the one that I want to highlight here is the desirableness of active service, a sermon preached to the 10th Connecticut at St. Augustine, Florida in April of 1864. And what he does is he uses like the book of Judges and this account of Joshua being called upon to fight the Gideonites and the Reubenites. I think that's, or the Gadites and the Reubenites. Or Joshua was in charge of them. I don't remember the exact theology behind it, but essentially he's using a biblical story to inspire the men to serve, to re-enlist in the army, and to say, occupation duty we don't want. We want to be like the army of Joshua fighting for in Canaan for the Holy Land, right? So he's drawing parallels between biblical motivations for fighting and the motivations for Connecticut Yankees to fight in this war that is now really a war of emancipation. At this point, by 1864, obviously the Emancipation Proclamation has been signed. There are a number of African American regiments in the service, and this is a quite successful sermon. So much so that it is reprinted and delivered, or I should say, disseminated all over Connecticut. And so, again, another sort of important little moment for Connecticut Yankees. One of the other things I want to highlight is as we get towards the end of the war, there's a wonderful resource that you can access at the Connecticut Museum, which is called the Connecticut War Record. And this is a detailed, I don't want to call it a newspaper exactly. It's a publication, maybe a magazine, you could call it. And it goes over the various events that are affecting Connecticut. And so this is about Major General Alfred Howe Terry and some of his efforts that are going on in the war. Again, he's a favorite son of Connecticut. And you can use this resource to really look at ways that people in Connecticut are talking about their soldiers at the battlefront. And that's one of the things I didn't do a good job of talking about here, but something that maybe in the future we could highlight is that the connection between home front and battlefront is very interesting. There's quite a divide between the two people who are serving on the front. They have different opinions about the war than people on the home front. And so these magazines try to tell, Connecticut Yankees, hey, the war is going well. Keep voting for Lincoln. Don't lose faith, stuff like that. Well, after the 10th leaves, the 10th and the 7th and the 6th Connecticut regiments are all going to leave South Carolina, and they're going to be sent to Virginia and to participate in the Overland Campaign. And these regiments are going to suffer greatly at the Battle of Drury's Bluff and the Battle of Deep Bottom. These are fought along the peninsula. The overall commander of the army there is a guy called Benjamin Butler, who's a Massachusetts politician. The regiments suffer very badly, and a number of them are going to be captured in this battle, Drury's Bluff, as well as Deep Bottom. And if you want to know more about this, the papers of Bartlett and the Churchill Woodford papers are excellent in giving you more information about it. The regiments also serve at Petersburg, Virginia, a massive siege that is about 8 or 9 months long, essentially. It is devastating. It is trench warfare that is going to be very similar to what we see in World War One. In fact, the Europeans probably should have studied this a little bit closer. They would have known what was coming for them in World War One, had they. And the various regiments there are going to, again, it's just like Battery Wagner, shot and shell every day, constantly under fire, really, really bad food. It's like for 6 months straight, you're getting nothing but wormy bread or moldy bread. And that obviously contributes to disease and to death. And a great resource for the siege of Petersburg is the Alfred Howe Terry Personal Military Papers. Alfred Terry, as I've told you many times, favorite son of Connecticut, goes from a colonel to a major general by the end of the war. He is in command of an army corps at one point during this, and he gets to talk a lot to Grant. And I didn't have the picture here, I really should have, but one of my the best things at being at the museum was I was holding a document that U.S. Grant had signed, and I was like, this is just the greatest thing ever, because I think U.S. Grant is like the greatest American general in history, and to actually hold something that he had written was like just a big moment for me, almost as big as when I held Lincoln's papers, and I was like, oh my, that's awesome. But anyway, so the Terry papers really go into a lot of detail about the experiences at Petersburg. So To transition back to St. Augustine to sort of end this presentation, the 17th Connecticut comes to the city in 1865. They are led by this man, Colonel William H. Noble. And Noble is a distinguished veteran of the war. He'd served at Gettysburg, he'd served at Chancellorsville, he'd seen, they'd been at some of the hardest fighting of the war, and it's now their time to get some rest and relaxation. And so they come to St. Augustine. And at first, things are going really, really well. But the 17th kind of lets its guard down. And William H. Noble is going to be on a little carriage ride with some ladies north of the town. Do I have let's see if I can pull up my little map here, because he's about captured right about here, north of town, on a carriage ride along what's called the Jacksonville Road. And he is going to spend the rest of the war, or most of the war, in Andersonville prison. Now, after that, we're going to see another event where the lieutenant colonel of the 17th, his name is Albert Wilkinson, he is going to be killed during a raid by J.J. Dickinson's cavalry. And he is, as I said, killed in combat. Now, Wilkinson, pardon me, is actually a Mason as well. And there's a really famous story in sort of Florida and Connecticut lore that the wife of Wilkinson writes to J.J. Dickinson asking for her husband's Mason's sword, in which J.J. Dickinson replies and sends it to her as a token of, I suppose, of esteem, or at least, we're both Masons, so I'm going to return this to a fellow Mason. So it's a really kind of interesting episode in Florida and Connecticut history. We also are going to see two separate engagements at a place called Dunn's Lake and at Braddock Farm, which is further to the south, further from St. Augustine. The 17th Connecticut is engaged in raids. They're spread out all over at this point, sort of northeast and kind of central Florida. And because they're so spread out, this means that a number of them are going to be assaulted by J.J. Dickinson's cavalry. They are going to be either killed or captured. And this man, for example, Adjutant H. Whitney Chatfield, he is going to be captured during one of these engagements, and he is going to be sent to Andersonville prison, as well as the assistant surgeon of the regiment, Henry S. Turrell, and a number of other individuals that I won't belabor you all the details with. And things are really, really terrible at Andersonville prison. It is the commandant of the prison camp is a guy called Henry Wirtz. He's the only man executed for his role in the Civil War, besides obviously the Lincoln assassination conspirators. He will, as I said, be executed after the war because tens of thousands of Union soldiers are packed into this tiny camp that could probably only support like maybe 5,000 men at the outside. And I think at its height, it had something like 20 to 30,000, I believe. And so the men suffer. Gangs form, attacking each other. They are fighting over food. If you get too close to this fence line here, you're going to be shot by a Confederate prison guard. And a really amazing resource to understand this experience of being in a prison camp is going to be Albert A. Hyde of the 6th Connecticut. He had been captured at, I believe, Deep Bottom or Drury's Bluff. It was one of those battles in Virginia. He spent the rest of the war, I believe, in Andersonville prison. He talks about the horrors that he saw there, and he has a full typed account. It's about 12 or so pages that he wrote in 1909, detailing his experiences there. So again, this is at the Connecticut Museum, and it's a wonderful resource if you want to understand more about prison camps. I should also have prefaced this by saying, why is Andersonville getting so many people inside? Well, it's because of a breakdown in the prisoner exchange system. There had been prisoner exchanges earlier in the war. The Confederates, for various reasons, decide that they would rather shoot African-American prisoners and soldiers when they come into contact with them rather than take them captive. And as a result, U.S. Grant is going to call off the exchange system. And so the prisons begin filling and filling and filling. And that is why we see Andersonville become such part of my language, a hellhole on earth as a result. To sort of wrap this all up here, Alfred Terry, by this point, I believe he's a brigadier general. This attack on Fort Fisher. It's one of the last major battles of the war in January of 1865. The 6th, the 7th Connecticut are all going to serve there. The 10th Connecticut will be there. A couple of Connecticut batteries, I think, as well as a number of Connecticut Yankees on various ships who take part in the bombardment. It is a major battle. It is a successful siege. It is going to be taken by Union forces. Terry is going to really, again, he's going to use this to catapult himself to the next level of his career. And so will Joseph R. Hawley. He serves very admirably in this battle, and he again uses this as a way to reach, I believe, brigadier general by the end of his term in command. So, if you want to know more about the siege of Fort Fisher and exactly how the Connecticut Yankees experienced that battle, the Minuot Ward letters in the museum are an excellent resource, and that is exactly how they look. It's printed on a weird piece of paper, and it's kind of hard to read, but it's still a very good sort of resource to have. But again, yeah, that is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was amazing. Learned a lot. That was great. If anyone has any questions, we can certainly open it up. People can put them in the chat. We're running a little late, but that's okay. We have some time.
Sorry.
Ah, Marcy's third great grandfather was Provost Marshal of St. Augustine. He was major in the 7th in New Hampshire.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. If you have any information about him that you would love to share, I'd be very much, I would love to see it. You can never have too many sources.
Speaking of sources, you showed us that one source that looked like almost like a newspaper type source. Oh, who produced that?
So the funny thing about Yankees is wherever they go, they find a way to set up a print shop somewhere. And they do it also in St. Augustine about some places. Sorry, the dog's whining. So essentially, the soldiers get a printing press, or I think they actually commandeered a printing press that may have already been nearby, and then they
Uh-huh.
begin to make their own newspaper, which is called the New South.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and I see someone on Grace, former resident of St. Augustine. Glad for you to join us. St. Augustine is a beautiful city. If any of you haven't gone, it's a lot of great shops to visit. The Columbiana restaurant. I'm not a sponsor. Just if you ever want really good food there, it's I recommend it.
It is amazing. We love living in both places.
Okay, good.
Interesting topic. So I did want to ask, will these images that you've got in your presentation today be available either in your chapter of your book or after this presentation?
So I think Jen told me that this will be put up on YouTube. A lot of the images I found were either at the museum or are open domain, essentially public domain. Simple Google searches will find them. But I mean, if you in terms of the letters themselves, I just literally kind of just like did a screenshot of the letter on my computer and just put it on there. But yeah, if you want to email me and have access to sort of the actual PowerPoint itself and maybe the various images I use, I can go ahead and send that.
I
Thank
noticed
you.
some of them were your own personal maps that you created for your dissertation, but is your dissertation, was that published?
Yeah, so that is actually from the thesis, which is published. My dissertation I've put on hold because I'm trying to turn it into a book. But it will be the book project is going to be a couple of years down the road, hopefully. I mean, these things are ridiculously slow, unfortunately, when you actually have to go and write it and then find a publisher. But I can't. Anyone who wants to have access to that map, I can make it available to them.
Do you, if you'd like, if you can, if you could put your email in the chat, that would be amazing. In the meantime, I had another question. You mentioned several different collections that we have, the Bartlett, the Terry. Are those mostly personal letters that they were writing to their families?
So it's a mixed bag. Some of them are diaries. So literally, it's just like a little tiny diary that's probably about like that big, that wide. And others are letters to friends, letters to family members, letters to the government. So Terry has letters that go back and forth to various military officials. He's talking to Lincoln, he's talking to Grant. Um, there are also, how do I want to say this? There are official like telegrams. So like towards the end of the war, especially related to the siege of Petersburg, you have like these generals and officers firing off telegrams multiple times every day. And one of the really cool ones I found was like a voting tally of all the regiments in the brigade and in the division and who they voted for in the election of 1864. And they broke it down like this regiment had this many for McClellan, this many for Lincoln. So, I mean, it's not only letters, but they're also maps. So there are a couple of those maps that I showed that are in like the official record book of the seventh. There are what do we call these giant account books that basically list like when the regiments or pardon me, when the soldiers enlisted, you know, their demographic information there, and then clothing information as well. Like there's giant books on like just all the clothing receipts related to these regiments. So it is a massively eclectic group of documents and pictures and other materials as well, including secondary sources, so books that you can actually get in the library itself, you know, things like town histories and genealogies and the like.
Anybody else have any other questions for Eric? There's so much information. It's a lot.
Yes, and I apologize for my quick speaking. When I get super excited about things, I end up just I can't help myself. It goes so
Well,
fast.
it's so much history. It's so rich. It's a lot to talk about. Anyone else? Well,
No,
I
just
will
thank you so
certainly.
much for doing this.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. And I will certainly post the recording. I usually email it to all the registrants, so you'll have that link. So everyone will get that as soon as it is ready, and I will send that to you as well, Eric. I know we're really short on time, but before we go, I wanted to mention a couple of upcoming events that we have. We have a behind the scene tours, our GFox tour. We have a huge collection of GFox memorabilia. If you're from Connecticut, you are very familiar with this iconic department store from Hartford. So we have behind the scene tours on November 30th and December 1st, and again on December 14th and 15th. Please check out our website for information on the timing. There are different times for those. Also on the 30th is the first of 3 workshops. You can do all 3 workshops or you can do them individually, whatever you like. The first one is on the 30th. It's a calligraphy for the holidays, where guests will make holiday gift tags and envelopes. There's no experience necessary. The second one is about printmaking. You'll make something as well for the holidays. That's on December 7th, and a stained glass workshop on December 14th. Again, all the dates and times are on our website. And our next Lunch and Learn, of course, I have to plug that, is December 3rd. James Fortuna, another New England Regional Fellowship Consortium grantee, will speak about the Civilian Conservation Corps in Connecticut and the link between the New Deal treatment of the American landscape and the promotion of our new national identity. So those are just some upcoming events. Of course, you can join us, look on our website, connecticutmuseum.org, for all our upcoming events. Eric, thank you again so much. This is such a fascinating history, much of which is new to me, but it's great to see that the museum has so many resources. So thank you. And please keep us informed of your book when it comes out. We'd love to have you back.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone. And Marcy Fuller, I put my email in there, so please email me at your earliest convenience. I would love to, and any of you, please email me if you have any questions or comments or you want copies of any of this. But thank you all for attending. This has been a wonderful experience. And again, thank you so much to the Connecticut Museum and the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. Bye, everyone.
Go Hogs.